And Mom and I actually would collect things from all over every canyon around the Morongo Basin. If it was edible, we would serve it. And my brothers were just petrified about what they were going to eat the next night.
This is the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, 30-minute conversations with women who have found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 123. Find out more about the podcast at desertladydiaries.com or engage with guests, listeners, and me on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries. Robin Kobaly is a botanist and plant ecologist with expertise in plant communities across the Mojave, Sonoran, and Southwest deserts. She is the executive director of the SummerTree Institute and president and co-founder of The Power of Plants. Robin has over 30 years' experience in plant ecology, wildlife biology, land use management, aerial photo interpretation, and natural history interpretation, including work as a botanist for the federal government for 21 years. Robin is the author of the new book, The Desert Underground, and received the 2019 Minerva Hoyt Conservation Award from the Joshua Tree National Park Association. I'm glad to have you here. Welcome.
Hi, Dawn. I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks. So the first question is usually, what was your first experience with desert? And your first experience was as a 2-year-old.
My family moved here from Los Angeles when I was 2 years old. I do remember a few things, stopping at a restaurant in Whitewater that isn't even there today. And I remember moving in, but my first really impactful interaction with the desert was when I was 6 years old. And it's an experience that I didn't tell anyone until I was about 45 years old.
Wow.
Because I was so afraid if I told people, me being a scientist, that they would think I was some kind of a wacko weirdo and that they wouldn't take me seriously. So I never told anyone until I finally got to that age where you stop caring that much, you know.
Right, yeah.
I finally related that story, and I'll tell you now, I was 6 years old when I went out with my mom and dad and my 2 brothers down a road in Morongo Valley, Samuel Drive, dirt road, during wildflower season, and we were all just looking at wildflowers, and my family ended up walking down the road farther than me, and I was kind of transfixed on this little gravel bajada, little open area, not perennial plants, but just a whole little field of annuals. And I laid down on my stomach, and I started looking at the plants, and I mean really looking at the plants, and I was amazed at all the patterns in the plants. I didn't know at the time that all of those were navigational guides for the pollinating insects to come in and show them exactly where the pollen was.
Oh, how interesting. I didn't know that. I'm learning something.
Yes. But at the time, I was just fascinated with the intricacy and the artwork and the colors and all that. And I remember every plant that was there. I didn't know their names back then, but now I know the name of all those plants I can remember.
Right.
But as I was sitting there looking at all these belly flowers and Wallace cereophyllum and purple mat and desert calico and all these, there was one Coulter snapdragon right there, which is not that common here. And all of a sudden, what I heard, and it sounded like it was coming from that Coulter snapdragon, but one of those plants there, I heard as plain as day, the plant said, "Everything you need to know, you will learn in the world of flowers."
Oh, wow.
And I, as 6 years old, just thought, it's normal when flowers talk to people, you know, and I thought, okay, I can understand that. I can do that. I can study flowers for my whole life. If that's where I have to go to learn everything I ever need to know, I'm there. So starting at 6 years old, I was into studying plants.
Oh, my goodness. And what a blessing to have that experience at 6 years old. You're not getting into your teens and 20s with those questions of, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? You kind of had direction pretty immediately.
I did. The ironic thing is that after all these years of studying, I truly started studying plants when I was 6 with my mom. That's another story. But ever since then, I mean, I have studied everything about plants, their, ecology, taxonomy, aerial photo interpretation. So from high above and under a microscope, my master's thesis, I was slicing leaves and looking under the microscope and taking photos and everything. So from all levels. And all these years later, I have yet to hear the flowers talk to me again.
Aw.
So I think I'm going too fast. I think I'm running too fast still.
Oh, interesting.
But my life has been dedicated to trying to protect them.
Right.
And everything I've done is to try to help people see how incredible they are so that they will protect them more. But in all of that busyness, I think, I haven't slowed down enough to have the flowers talk to me again.
Maybe. So what are you doing? What are you implementing into your life that you feel is going to perhaps allow for that to happen again?
Good question. I'm not going fast in that direction right now because I'm involved in another project that I really hope helps the protection and conservation of the desert. And it's a program that I started with our environmental education nonprofit, the SummerTree Institute, called the Desert Underground. And
Of which the book is titled.
the book, yeah, that's what just titled the book. And it started out, I was asked to just write a scientific paper for the San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors to explain to them what happens when the surface of this desert soil is disturbed, because people only understand, because it's what they see, the impacts above ground when you scrape the ground. They have no idea what's happening underground.
And scraping the ground for things like solar fields.
Yeah, for industrial scale solar, right? Thousands and thousands of acres. And so I was just asked to write a paper so that the Board of Supervisors would understand the ramifications of their decisions and their voting when they voted on the renewable energy and conservation element of the general plan for the county that was going to involve whether or not to strengthen the language or relax the language about allowing large-scale solar projects inside community boundaries of our rural areas. And the community boundaries are, inside of that's where all the houses are. And the county, inside areas that didn't have their own city councils, had been approving large-scale solar projects inside community boundaries. You could look out your window here and maybe see a large-scale.
Well, people in 29 have it right off their road. Yeah.
Newberry Springs, Daggett, even some people in Lucerne Valley.
Right.
And so this was a paper. I was just asked to write a scientific paper. And so I started writing with all the citations, very, very technical and everything, because I have been lecturing about this for at least a decade. Well, I got about 3/4 of the way through, and I said, nobody's going to read this. It's just too dense, So I said, well, I'm going to put a lot of pictures in it. And then I said, you know what? I'm just going to do the whole thing in pictures. And so I asked a friend of mine if she could do the background picture for me that I could put my graphics on top of and my labeling and stuff.
Right.
And I ended up making a booklet of a presentation in slip sheet presentation folders to give to the Board of Supervisors for their consequential vote on this. And so I made copies for all of them, and they did a vote, and luckily they ended up voting the way that we had all hoped, and that was to not allow any future large-scale, industrial solar projects inside community boundaries of rural areas in all of San Bernardino County. So that was really great, but then everybody that saw me give those to them said, can I get a copy? Well, those copies were very expensive because I was having them printed, full bleed, trimmed, slip sheeted in there, everything. So as we got more and more people asked me to do it, I said, you know what, I think I'm just going to write this into a book. I actually did. I wrote it into a book, and I've been very happy with the response to it because everybody really does want to know what's happening in the desert.
Well, and so much of it seems, to me, it seems so technical. You lay on top of the science all of the rules and restrictions and ordinances and general plans, and it just becomes noise, and then people walk away from it and go, this is just too complicated. I don't understand what's right and what's wrong. So
by offering it in this way. And the words in the pictures too, I think I mentioned people learn both ways, and sometimes it's easier to see it than just to read it and imagine it. But if you can see what it does while you're reading it, I think it's much more impactful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that project that just started out as an innocent little scientific paper for evidence in a public hearing has already morphed itself into a lot of things, and one of them was an exposition, a full display basically of all the graphics in the whole book.
Wow.
On big posters, on big display boards at the 29 Palms Art Expo last September. We presented the whole thing that way, and people were very impacted about that. And so we'd gotten our first printing of the book that we released at the same time as that. So that is a display that we are hoping to have as a traveling show. It's wonderful, but it is work. You know what I mean?
Sure. Well, you've got to schedule everything and make your calendar, and then the logistics of getting all the stuff to the places and getting the word out.
But even bigger than that is that we are working now on developing a documentary, a full-length documentary about the whole thing. That's, you're in production. I mean, what that takes. So I'm seeing this Desert Underground program as a project that is so needed right now when we have so many demands and even laws being put into place in California that are setting goals for our renewable energy limits. And everybody thinks that the way to do that is to blade over the entire desert with solar panels, as far as you can see, going into the pristine desert. And what our premise is in this book and through the whole program is absolutely solar is the way to go. Look at all the disturbed areas we already have, the rooftops, the parking lots.
Or agriculturally spent land.
Old agricultural lands, all those things are where we should focus. So it seems like right now is the time, we have all these renewable energy goals right in front of us, is the time to launch all this.
Absolutely.
So then when I get that done, Dawn...
to run back to the flowers.
Yeah, to get back to the flowers. Then I hope to.
Well, I want to ask you two more questions about the solar, and then we'll move on to some other things. So, first of all, describe the importance of the desert soils and why it's important to keep them in place and not blade them, and the good effect that they have on us.
Okay. The desert is so much more alive than people expect. And even though I have been studying this for so long, it was surprising to me when I learned even new things while I was doing more research on this about what's happening underground. When you look above ground, you think that everything that's happening is just those plants and maybe there's some roots underground. But it turns out that for every plant that you see above the ground in the desert, the roots that go below ground can be between 3 and 11 to 12 times as deep as the plant is tall. Wow. We even have plants like mesquite. Honey mesquite has been discovered to have roots at least 150 feet deep.
Wow.
So there's extremely deep roots so that the plants can get down to moisture that may have fallen 5 years ago. And if we have a 2 or 3 year drought, you still see the creosotes are perfectly green.
Right.
And it's because their roots are going down to water that has been absorbed into the ground years and years ago, and they are deep enough to go to a place where the soil is not evaporating that moisture. In addition to that, all of these plants are living in soil that's pretty much devoid of nutrients and not a lot of moisture. And so they have partnered up with a fungus, with different species of fungus that are really good at absorbing moisture and nutrients out of the soil. But they can't make their own food. And the plants can make their own food, but they have a hard time absorbing the very little nutrients and moisture. So they've partnered up and have a great relationship together where the little fungal threads go out like I call it a 3-dimensional doily underground, go out on a search and rescue mission to get everything that plant host needs, and then they bring it all back to the roots and basically super inject it into the plant.
Wow.
And those nutrients go up to the top of the plant, make sugars. The sugars come back down to feed the roots, and that's where their root partners are attached that need the sugars too. So they maybe share 20% of their sugars to get maybe 75 to 80% more nutrients and moisture than they could get on their own. So it's a very good trade for both partners. Well, that's all going underground, but every single thread of it's called mycelium, all the little threads of the fungus are covered with a water seal, basically. This great thing, magical thing called glomalin. And this glomalin actually is made out of the carbon captured from the air. And it is coated on every single thread. As we walk over the ground, we are walking over hundreds and hundreds to thousands of miles of mycelium every time we take a step in the desert. It's teeming underground with all this stuff happening. And the carbon that is taken out of the air and that coats every one of those is holding carbon underground without us doing anything between 30 and 100 years on every single little hair-like thread of everything. Besides that, there is a outbreathing underground of carbon when the plant is breathing in carbon dioxide, and then it breathes out in the dark, breathes out carbon dioxide. And that carbon is combining with the calcium in the soil right at the interface where their plant partner hooks into the root. They're both breathing out. They're making crystals of calcium carbonate, the calcium from the soil and the carbon from the air, making calcium carbonate crystals, which everybody knows as caliche. And everybody hates caliche, but it is actually a huge lockbox of carbon in our desert soils that is keeping carbon underground. So all of these plants that we just talked about are every plant that if you just walk out in the desert and you look around you, you'd be hard-pressed to find any plant besides a little summer annual, or an annual that comes up and goes. You'd be hard-pressed to find any plant that is not as old as you to hundreds of years to thousands of years old.
Right.
And every one of those plants is sequestering carbon, sending it down, breathing it out, making these caliche crystals, holding it all underground, and all those glomalin coatings of all of those threads are sequestering carbon. So without
let's blade the land.
That's exactly right. On the guise of saving us from all the carbon, let's blade everything.
Right.
And then spend several years bringing in trucks that are burning fossil fuels and bringing in generators, fossil fuels, and doing all
that
this.
now can't be absorbed because the plants are gone.
That's exactly right. And so the bottom line is we need to think twice about plowing up vast areas of the desert in the name of saving carbon.
Well, this leads me to my other question, which is what is the resistance, do you think, to rooftop solar? Is it that the electric company's like, oh, shoot, we're going to be out of business?
I think it's something pretty basic like that, because if you look at your electric bill and you look at the charges, there's charges for generation, and then there's charges for transmission. And the transmission charges are usually more than the generation charges, which means the farther out that they put the generator, the more money they can get to transport it to your house.
Wow.
So the smart thing to do, of course, is to have it at your point of use, right on your roof, or right in your parking lot.
Right.
But then they don't make any money from that, and this is just the structure of power companies. They've been set up to have power that is not at the point of source.
Right.
And this is what their whole premise is based on. I just keep thinking, look, it's gonna come. It's coming anyway. Get on board. You know, Southern Cal Edison and PG&E, be the ones that put them on. Be the ones that do all that. But we have a ways to go there.
Right. I want to switch gears a little bit because you started telling me a little information before we turned the mic on about a poster that you had found about plants used in Native people's weaving, and then we got into plant dyes. Can you start to tell that story a little bit again?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been absolutely fascinated with the use of native plants since I was 6 years old. And actually, my mom and I started together researching.
It seems like it was a really bonding experience for the two of you.
It really was.
Yeah.
There's more funny stories about that. With my grandmother talked my mom into going out and picking plants for the Morongo Valley Wildflower Show that my grandmother started.
And then you were the wildflower
And
queen at 6 years old.
Yes, nepotism, yes.
Right. But your grandmother was also the first librarian of Morongo Valley.
She started almost everything,
Wow.
as somehow women do in this valley.
Absolutely.
Start all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so my mom and I started just doing that for the Wildflower Show, but we became very fascinated, not just with identifying the plants, but their uses. So I've been studying plant uses since I was about 6 years old, and Mom and I actually would collect things from all over every canyon around the Morongo Basin. If it was edible, we would serve it. And my brothers were just petrified about what they were going to eat the next night. But we were both very interested in all of the uses of plants by Native Americans. Well, one of the big uses was dye plants for basket weaving, some of them for textiles, sometimes for paints, for ceremonial paints on their, like, face paints and body paints and things, and all dyes for a lot of reasons. But one that really fascinates me is the prickly pear cactus apples that are very deep purple.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
And so there's a dye throughout the whole plant that it shows up only in the ripe fruits, but it's actually within the whole plant, but you don't see it because it has to be oxidized to really see that dye. And there are insects that love to suck the juice of prickly pears, but they don't want to be seen because they don't want the birds to come and pick them off, so they cover themselves with this cottony cushion. So it looks like a bunch of gunk stuck on the plants. Well, and if you wipe that off, you just get this burst of purple. And that is a dye that was used by the Aztecs centuries and centuries ago to dye all of the robes of the royalty. Wow. But it took so many of these little cochineal insects that were harvested and then dried and then ground up and added with water and something to make the dye stick in the textiles, and then soaked in there, that only the royalty could afford to hire the slaves to get enough cochineal insects to make a robe. And that's why only royalty had purple robes.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that again. I really appreciate that. So you grew up here in the desert, but you've traveled. Have you ever left the desert like, I'm leaving and I'm going somewhere else and I'm not coming back, and came back? Or were you always just here in the desert?
My family moved here when I was 2 years old from Los Angeles, and I have deep roots in Morongo Valley. My great-grandparents bought property up in Upper Big Morongo Canyon in the area that's now known as Sherman Shady Springs. And my great-grandfather was William, or Billy Sherman. So Billy and Maud Sherman built up in Upper Big Morongo Canyon. And then they had my mom come out every summer, and they kept a horse there for her.
Aww.
And then my stepdad ended up taking care of my great-grandmother. And I mean, the whole family just has more and more ties back to here. So my family ended up moving from LA to here when I was 2. And I lived with my family here in Morongo until I was 18, and I went to UC Riverside. And I left because I wanted to go to college. And I ended up getting my bachelor's degree, my master's degree, and then got hired by the Bureau of Land Management to work on the California Desert Plan. And when we finished the California Desert Plan, the employees had to be shipped to different places because that plan staff was now, we all knew how to work and all that, but we were winding down. So they opened up an office in Palm Springs for what's now called the Palm Springs Field Office. So I ended up moving back to Morongo Valley at that time, and also because I was pregnant with our first child and I wanted the kids to grow up with their parents. So I moved back. So I moved just for 18 years for school and then work. But came back, and I've been here ever since.
Tell me about learning that you were the 2018 recipient of the Minerva Hoyt Conservation Award.
Oh, well, that was a surprise, I have to say. I think I felt very honored to be even mentioned in the same sentence as Minerva Hoyt. She knocks
Pretty amazing.
my socks off.
Right?
The things
I mean,
that
just
she
packing
did.
cactuses and taking them over to England to show people the desert.
She was
At that time.
amazing. Yes,
Yeah.
she did 2 big garden shows,
Oh my gosh.
in Europe, and took sand and boulders and the plants.
Yeah.
And she even, at one point, she was keeping, I think in the show in New York, she was keeping the plants in her bathtub in her hotel room to keep them good and keep replacing them as they kind of wilted and everything.
Right.
So no, I was very honored that my peers would think that I could be in the same sentence as Minerva Hoyt.
Right. So being here all this time in the desert, what are some of your favorite things to do when you're not working on your documentary and your book and educating our board of supervisors?
Well, I love to work out in our garden. We have a demonstration garden, and so I'm trying to show all the variety of drought-tolerant plants you can have. That a drought-tolerant landscape isn't a whole bunch of cactus. It can be anything that you look across our landscape here and see is drought-tolerant,
Right.
and they're not all cactus. And they are used to surviving for a year or more with almost no rain. And if you invite them into your yard and you water them maybe every other month, say, they think they died and went to heaven. So they look gorgeous, and they're going to look so much better than they do most of the year when there's no rain and they're dormant. So I love that. I love bird watching. I keep, extensive bird lists of what we see. I do love to play the piano and guitar, and I love artwork. I do, and I haven't. My artwork has suffered a little bit. I end up doing art as it's needed, like I do a lot of logos for things and for messaging campaigns and for nonprofits and things I've done. I'm not doing my artwork as much as I wish I could. I love to stand-up paddle with my husband. He is...
Oh, fun. He has a marine biology background, right?
He has a marine biology background, and it has been so fascinating looking at the desert through his eyes, because we met at a Watchable Wildlife Conference. We were both speakers in Huntington Beach, and he told me that when he used to talk about the ocean floor, when it's down beyond where light hits, and so therefore it can't grow kelp or things like that, he used to say, oh, the ocean bottom is like a desert. There's nothing there. Well, after we got married and I started talking about all this stuff, he said, Robin, I have to admit, he said, I have totally changed my lectures. I cannot call the ocean floor a desert, because if I do that, it's not accurate, because the desert has more biodiversity than a lot of places with more rain.
Wow.
They don't have the same biomass, not as much biomass, but they've got a higher diversity. And there's so many things happening that you can't even see. Some things you have to slow down and get really close to see, and some things you can't see without a microscope. But he says, I don't anymore lecture about the ocean floor being as barren as a desert. So,
did he grow up near the ocean and so how was that move for him to the desert?
well, it was a huge thing. His friends thought that he was crazy because he surfed or snorkeled or swam every single day of his life. He's lived in Marin County and Stinson Beach and Laguna Beach for 25 years before we got married. So he and the ocean were one and the same. And then we met at the ocean, but then he had to drive all the way out here, and our first date was him helping me cut tamarisk with a crew down at Big Morongo Canyon Preserve. I was managing Big Morongo Canyon when we met. And he just said, how could I possibly leave the ocean? But he met me and he said, I've only been looking for you my whole life, so I'll move anywhere. So he moved out here, and they ended up really appreciating the desert because he got to see it through my eyes.
Yeah.
But it was so interesting because I got to see it through his eyes, and I could see how most people view the desert and where I had to change my interpretation of it in order to reach people who aren't used to having to stop and look as close and as long as it takes to view the desert to actually see what's happening here.
Right.
So it's been a great two-way street.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for coming and talking with me today. It's been wonderful, and I've learned a lot of things, too.
Oh, yeah.
But before I let you go, I'm going to shake up my little question number chips and ask you to pick 2, please.
Okay.
If you're new to the podcast, this will be part of the Diary Unlocked portion of the episode, and I will ask Robin 4 questions, and that content will be available to the Patreon subscribers of the podcast. So if you're interested in becoming a Patreon subscriber, I'd ask that you go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support page, and there you'll find all the information about becoming a patron. So, with your chips chosen, the chips are down, if you will. We've got, what's your favorite driving or road trip music? What's the last thing you watched on TV, and why did you watch it? Since coming to the desert, what have you been surprised to discover about yourself? What are a few things you're really grateful for? So again, if you're interested in hearing Robin's answers to those questions, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support page, and become a patron. Thanks again for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Dawn. I'm glad that you are honoring women in this whole basin. These women knock my socks off all
They're
the time.
amazing.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I've got some shout outs today to Louisa B. I hope I'm saying that right, Louisa. And Catherine D. Thank you so much for signing up for the new episode newsletter. I really appreciate you. And to Juanita and Trent, listeners from Canada, who stopped into Soul Connection. So glad to meet you too. Thanks for stopping in, and thanks for listening. So a bit of late notice, if you're listening to this on the release date of March 10th, 2020, I want to let you know that I'll be speaking about the podcast tomorrow, March 11th, at the Palm Springs Public Library as part of their Nature Series presented by the Joshua Tree National Park Association. The library is located at 300 South Sunrise Way, and the lecture begins at 6:30 in the Learning Center. Being Women's History Month, I feel really privileged to be sharing stories of desert women with them in this program. This podcast is funded through the generosity of listeners like you. If you want to help support great storytelling, go to desertladydiaries.com and click on the support page. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.